Hi there. William Fairbairn was noted for several knife designs. Firstly, the Fairbairn Sykes Commando Dagger, the Smatchet, later modified in the United States as the Fair Sword, also in the United States the Fairbairn Millicent. And these became well known, particularly the Fairbairn Sykes, which is in production and indeed in military service to this day. And they were all created during World War II. But then it wasn't until the 90s that we were alerted to another more recent design, post-war design. And we were alerted by William Cassidy, who has long been a researcher and an author on the World War II combatives. And that article I just showed you is one of the very first to go into real depth on silent killing. And he authored a couple of books which I've reviewed here, and they're really highly recommended. Anyway, he started posting material about a new knife that had been designed by Fairbairn, which was called the Cobra. In 1956, Fairbairn was training the Cyprus police, and it was during this time that he continued his wartime activities in the civilian sphere. And to quote, the bulk of this effort was devoted to training riot police, authoring a riot manual, and developing a bulletproof shield he called the Stone. And this is quoting Cassidy. Singularly, he also spent considerable effort on developing something he called the Cobra fighting knife. His interest in this weapon and the system of knife fighting it supported continued after he returned to England and occupied his attention up until his death. No doubt inspired by changes he saw in post-war Asia, the empire was crumbling. He foresaw a time when Western-trained knife fighters would confront Eastern-trained knife fighters. While he had confidence in the Shanghai School methods, of which he was the principal author, he was less sanguine about the abilities of the various practitioners. He also saw trouble looming in the Middle East, so he set about to instruct himself in the indigenous forms of knife fighting to be found there. Such thinking was, of course, a measure of his greatness. The style of play is quite unique. Whereas the Shanghai School is centered on speed, the Cobra style is centered on confusion. Still, the two do have something in common. Fairbairn privately instructed that the method in knife fighting is to employ the blade like a snake's tongue, and this is what inspired him to name his weapon the Cobra. I do not know of many people in his era who went to the depths he did in this art. For example, he studied sleight of hand to see if he could incorporate a professional magician's misdirection methods, and these he worked into the Cobra style. I also noticed the style to have much in common with certain Chinese styles, albeit with a distinctly Middle Eastern flavour. So among the information that William Cassidy very generously shared back in, I think it was 1991, was a complete copy of the Cobra manual written by Fairbairn. This was never actually published in print, and the version that Mr. Cassidy gave us has underlinings and crossing out, but you can still see what the original was as he revises the text. Unfortunately, and this is the big weakness, there are no illustrations. There are references to illustrations, but either the photography or the drawings for these weren't completed or they've been lost. To quote from the manual, "We believe that the time has arrived when the bayonet should be discarded as no longer effective and, like the pike, placed among the weapons of the past. There can be no doubt, once you have handled a scientifically designed fighting knife, that you would prefer it to a bayonet, particularly if the fighting was to take place under any of the following conditions: over rooftops, up and down stairs, climbing up ship sides, crossing streams up to your waist in water, in dense jungle or through paddy fields. Under such conditions, a bayonet attached to a rifle would be a severe handicap." Yeah, obviously what he was talking about there is the kind of operation which has been widely undertaken in many spheres since then. Shipboarding underways, the jungle in Borneo, Malaya and Borneo, and also urban raids in densely packed areas and in small buildings. That's all very, very true. However, his prediction that the bayonet would fall into misuse has proven to be incorrect. And, you know, as recently as the Falklands, the British Army was using the fixed bayonet. And because the infantry soldier will have a rifle, it makes sense to have the bayonet as well. Let's have a detailed look at the Cobra. Now, this is a photograph that was shared by Bill Cassidy of the prototype. And from that photograph, everything that we're going to discuss really has followed. However, there's a caution. Again, a quote: "The two prototypes he had bear only slight resemblance to the blueprint. His son told me," this is Fairbairn's son, "told me that he didn't like the prototypes and that he couldn't find anybody in Britain who cared to help him." So an important point, the Cobra knife we have is not exactly what Fairbairn requested or designed. I don't know what the differences are. I've never seen a photograph of the blueprint, which is unfortunate. To my knowledge, 2 knife makers have offered their versions of the Cobra. Dan Brock in the United States was the first. I have had knives made by Dan, and he does really great work, particularly on his reproductions of First World War and Second World War weapons. I didn't get a Cobra, but as you can see, it's faithful to the prototypes. And then the second one is by Paul Macdonald, the Macdonald Armoury, which I acquired via my good friend Victor, who sent it to me. And that's the knife that I'm going to evaluate here. So this is it, the Macdonald Armoury's version of the Cobra. And I did an online review on the forum, and one of the points I made is that the sheath, to me, is much less than ideal. It's made out of glove leather, and it's a type which clings to the knife very, very rigidly, and it's very difficult to draw, particularly one-handed. So to me that's a problem. Also, there's no welt on the edge side, and eventually if you were using this a lot it would cut through the stitching. So to me that's a weakness. It's a 10-inch blade overall, just over 14 inches, and it's very impressive design, and I was expecting something rather unwieldy to arrive, but I was pleasantly surprised by how the knife felt in the hand. The balance is good, and it's not as massive as I thought it might be, and it's quite a surprisingly user-friendly weapon. The handle is made from oak, and it fits my rather large bass player hands quite well, so it should fit most people. It's checkered for grip, but the only negative I'd say is there's tool markings. I'll put a picture, the tool markings. The back is grooved here for placement for the saber grip, which I think Fairbairn does allude to it in the manual, and it certainly was a very popular grip at one time. It has been discarded by Bob Casper, who was a great proponent of the saber grip, but he pointed out the weakness of it. The blade is the best part. It's sturdy construction, beautifully curved, and with a wicked point. And one final point, I'll just say that it's quite handy in play, and for me the downward point is much more natural and usable than the upward point of for example, the Jordan knife, the Jordanian military knife, which I've reviewed. So for me that was much better. Okay, the Cobra, Fairbairn's final knife design, and we're just going to look at a couple of the techniques that are particularly apt with this knife. Now, in the notes, there's no illustrations, but in the notes he does a few techniques. One of them is just from this start position to do a slash, turn and come back, turn and come back. And then he does the same as a whipping action, and he does another one from this position where you turn, face the other way and do a slash. Okay, well we're going to look at some other options that you can do. So the first one is a snap thrust or a snap cut. So from a ready position, you're just basically punching the knife out to full extension. Okay, punching out to full extension, and then retracting. So side view would be, okay. So the tip, you're aiming for the neck area, subclavian, possibly the head or a limb. Another alternative is to use a snap cut on the various angles. So on a number 1 angle, you can do a snap cut on a 1, you can do a snap cut on a 2, you can do a low line snap cut to his leg. Okay. Then we have combinations where you can snap twice, do a double action, cutting twice. Okay. Then we have slashes, the normal draw cut slashes using the edge, and the curved blade's ideal for this. And it's just your normal lines, the high line and the midline. And you can combine them in any way. So you can do a double. Okay. You can also do the return line. So slash and return, slash and return. And you can combine it with a double and a return. Another technique is to use the midline rising slash here. Comes up the midline going into the abdomen, kind of a grollicking, in Fairburn's terminology, cut. But it could take a limb, can do many things. So they're just a few of the techniques you can do which are ideally suited to this particular knife. Okay, some final thoughts. In the manual, as mentioned, Fairbairn foresaw a time when Western knife fighters would come across the Middle Eastern / Far Eastern trained knife fighters on the field of conflict. And he was worried that the standard of the Western knife fighters had degraded. Well, it did happen to a small extent. For example, Marcus Wynn pointed out that a lot of the Middle Eastern terrorist groups were getting training in knife work from the Filipino terrorists with the strong blade culture from there. But in a broader context, that really hasn't happened. However, it has happened culturally with the explosion of martial arts since the time of Fairbairn. We've been exposed to all sorts of martial arts from all over the world, and this includes the weapon, more specifically the blade arts. For example, excuse me, the Filipino martial arts, eskrima and so on, very rich in knife work, is now found in all the major cities. You can train in its use, and so we have become much more knowledgeable and skilled in everything. James Keating's school on the Bowie knife, Bob Casper's knife Combatives, which is a pared down system he taught to the United States Special Operations people. So it's all available. Never a better time, really. And likewise, the weapons. When Fairbairn came over to the UK, one of the reasons he designed with Sykes the commando dagger was he says you couldn't buy a decent fighting knife in the United Kingdom. Well, that's changed now, and knife designs are readily available, very high class, very well thought out, to suit any taste, any system, and any application, whether it's civilian or military. For me, the Cobra is an interesting part of the evolution of the knife, particularly the Fairbairn arc of knife designs, but it's really no more than that. It's not something that I've devoted a lot of time to, and I don't think that anybody's going to really seriously consider it as a usable self-protection or frontline weapon. Rather, it's a curiosity, a collector's item. But it's an interesting part of the story, and we really must thank William Cassidy for his diligent research and for sharing it with us. And everything in this video has really come from that initial revelation of the existence of the prototype and the documents. So thanks to Mr. Cassidy.